All right, basically, I wanted to give you some extra lecture on the chapters that you're reading for McIntyre this week in the middle week. So these lectures are not meant to give you the whole picture of emotivism, but rather to kind of give you some hints to help you read the chapters that you have because they're quite hard, but I think not inaccessible, with a few pokes in the right direction and just some general defining. You'll probably have to look up some stuff on your own, but do your best to plug through it and know that you cannot just cite this lecture in your responses to the prompt questions and responses to your peers. You must draw from the reading, and so this only serves to back up the reading. So make sure that you're doing that as you're going forward from here. So without further ado, let's get started. So what is emotivism? Just a general basic philosophical definition of emotivism is value judgments that value judgments in general and ethical judgments in particular express emotions rather than representing facts. So you might notice that in the word emotivism it looks like emotion. That's not misleading. That is actually quite to the case. So basically what it means is that you determine something is good or that something is right based on how you feel about it, not necessarily because it is something that is true or good or beautiful or something that is worth investing in or worth doing, but something because it feels right. Now, what I hope you know is and see is that this really points to a lot of the problems in the way that moral discourse is carried out today and the way that moral arguments are carried out today. It is not just that we suffer from a loss of language, which is a huge part of emotivism, but that basically the appeals that we make are not tied to any particular tradition or fact or truth, but rather some internal feeling or something that is pleasing to us that we really are geared towards choosing just because of an emotion or disposition within us to choose that thing, not based on fact. So if that's a little bit confusing, wait a little bit longer. We're going to get back to that after we go through basically what McIntyre is doing here. So After Virtue is probably one of the most important ethics books or books in moral philosophy of the 20th century, if not, for much longer than that. It's a very wonderful book. He begins with a study of why we have gotten to this point in moral discourse. So he begins with this really great case study talking about science as kind of a way to set up what he's going to do with moral philosophy. So he talks about, imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer some major catastrophe, and basically, just to summarize what he's saying here, imagine that like the scientific community suffered this huge loss. Like every scientist in the world died or was imprisoned. Science ceased to be taught in schools. And so after a while, we would lose concept of what science is, the grammar that defines it, what type of practices, the scientific method, all of that stuff would just simply go away. But then imagine that years later, somebody finds a source book, and this is like, hundreds of years after the last scientist has been put to death or put in prison, and the last science class is taught. So hundreds of years later, somebody finds like, a science textbook like you would find in your high school classes or maybe even in some of your college classes. And people started to argue about scientific facts. Now, what is the problem in that? What's the problem in that? They would have no idea what the language was that guided their thought. They wouldn't be ingrained in the habits and practices of what it means to do science. And so you might notice that what he's saying here is that there's no objective reality, no objective field, no objective, basically like objective writing that is ingrained deeply within the ethos that would make that rediscovery of science a helpful one. You would just have a bunch of people running around talking about words that they don't really know or understand. He says that this is the case of what we have with moral discourse. We have lost the ability to deal with the moral language necessary to make moral arguments intelligible. So to prove that, you might have noticed at the very front of his chapter, the first chapter that you have to deal with, chapter 2, moral disagreement today and the claims of emotivism. He goes through 3 moral positions, like the idea of a just war, the idea of abortion, and the idea of like the presence of public services that care for public justice situations. So he notes there are different positions on all of these things, but notes how there is no objective source by which you can, in any of these positions, come to some type of middle ground, or where these moral disagreements can be brought to some type of conclusion, or brought to some type of resolution, rather. So he notes that like our inability to kind of get past these like staunch positions is kind of tough, because we don't have any objective principles to kind of guide us through these things. So the aim of the whole book is to try and get us to a place where we can come to some type of conclusions about our moral arguments. And so, because of the fact that we don't have any way to conclude or resolve any type of moral arguments, our moral discourse suffers from shrillness. And if you're wondering what he means by shrillness, just watch anything on any like argument on the news between positions, between somebody maybe on the right or on the left. You just have a bunch of people yelling about things, and no one ever really resolves the issue. That type of like anger, frustration, that emotional upheaval that happens when people of differing positions are brought into conversation with one another. That's what he means by shrillness. And basically, if somebody were to impose a conclusion on somebody else, this is another problem. It's seen as this kind of reaction against the impersonal. So if I were to tell you to do this, do something, for example, if I was the government, I told you to go to war, that would seem rather impersonal, because the question that you would immediately ask is why. And if I responded like something it pleases the government, or it's something that I think you should do, something I wish you would do, or even more so, it's your duty, that's a very impersonal reason. We have to be motivated to do it ourselves. And lastly, another thing that our moral discourse suffers from is a lack of historical appeal. So how many times, count in the news, do you notice that any type of moral argument is being constructed from some type of historical perspective? So, for example, say that you were watching the news and watching for an argument to go to war. How many times do you see someone appeal to Machiavelli, or appeal to Augustine in the just war tradition? You don't really see it that much. You just kind of see someone up there giving random motivations towards performing some type of violent coercive actions. We've kind of lost the ability to know that these moral positions come out of a history. And we, rather than appeal to the history and work with the history, we make the history fit our own ends, rather than study history as an objective science that guides what type of moral arguments we can make. Now, this is the problem of emotivism. All of this above, the 3 examples that he outlines, and the 3 problems with our moral discourse today. It's basically what he sees as the problem of emotivism in our time, and why we are not good at making moral arguments. So this gets to MacIntyre specifically on emotivism. That definition I gave you a couple slides ago is not MacIntyre, but just kind of a general encyclopedic definition. He specifies even further that emotivism is about moral judgments that are preferences rather than facts. So I am choosing to go to war rather than the fact is that I should go to war. So see the difference there. Now, it's not to say that there isn't personal choice involved when you're dealing with facts, but rather war is my preference rather than the objective right thing to do in a particular situation. There's a very, very big difference between those two, and I hope you can see that. Another thing he mentions is that moral arguments are rather now about affecting one's emotions rather than anything to do with rational arguments. So, for example, if you watch like some of the presidential debates or the Republican debate, Democratic debate, or when they debate each other, you'll note that there's a lot of applause in the audience. Now, it's not because we think they're appealing to truth claims. Now, he goes on to say that it's not as if emotivism is completely absent of truth claims. He makes an argument, or he makes a point about arson is wrong, and he points to some certain objective facts about arson being problematic for a variety of reasons. It's not to say that they aren't logically excluded from certain facts, but rather that there is a sense in which the moral position that one takes is more about how one's emotions are stirred up. And evaluating one position is about the emotions that are stirred up rather than the facts of the case. So, if you want to see, real quick, I'm looking for, yes. So on page 12 is where he talks about this arson thing. Arson being the destructive property is wrong, and unites the factual judgment that arson destroys property with the moral judgment that arson is wrong. So there are facts about property being destroyed that tells us that arson is wrong, but the moral element in such a judgment is always to be sharply distinguished from the factual. Factual judgments are true and false. In the realm of fact, there are rational criteria by means we may secure agreement as to what is true and false. But moral judgments, being expressions of attitudes or feelings, are neither true nor false. An agreement in moral judgment is not to be secured by any rational method, for there are none. It is to be secured, if at all, by producing certain non-rational effects on emotions or attitudes of those who disagree with one another. We use moral judgments not only to express our own feelings and attitudes, but also precisely to produce such effects in others. And so the distinction between the moral and the factual is very clear here. Facts represent some type of objective criteria in the world that we can measure and quantify, but the moral arguments, as they exist today as being influenced by emotivism, are boiling down to basically dealing with and convincing others by affecting their emotions. So, for example, when Donald Trump stands up there and says, I want to ban all Muslims, he's making a moral argument, trying to prey on and affect the emotions, the fears of the American public in order to sway him to some type of moral position that he has. It's not an objective fact that all Muslims do terrorism. That's actually way beyond the point. And so the fact of the matter is that he is making a moral argument that is claiming that he he's making a moral argument that affects emotions rather than dealing with objective facts. So if you'll note, he starts this historical move with G.E. Moore and kind of describes that in detail. So I'll leave that to you to look that up. But basically, he talks about how Moore distinguishes the language of the good from being some type of reality that exists independent of the self, of the person making the decisions, and rather makes the good a judgment of the person rather than an objective thing that exists in the world or something that is right within the world. So that's a very big historical move that he's pointing out, and something that is a part of the trajectory that constructs the moral self today. So basically, I also want to give you this before I switch to the summary. If you didn't notice, also on page 12, it's like that right after that section I just told you about arson. Emotivism is thus a theory which professes to give an account of all value judgments whatsoever. Clearly, if it is true, all moral disagreement is rationally interminable. And clearly, if it is true, then certain of the features of the contemporary moral debate to which I draw the attention earlier do indeed have nothing to do with what is specifically contemporary. But is it true? Emotivism, and here's the point, has been presented by its most sophisticated protagonist hitherto as a theory about the meaning of sentences which are used to make moral judgments. So it is not necessarily about what is true, but is about the meaning that we create behind the sentences that we use to distinguish what is true and what is good and all of that stuff. So this is the essence of emotivism here. We're trying to get to the point of understanding that most of our moral arguments that we're making are constructed based on what we are deciding and what we are determining is the good. And so we are not drawn to it by objective criteria that names it as the good, but we're drawn to it by our emotional feelings about it. This is indicative of a lot of things that it takes to be a contemporary human being today. That we are making decisions not based on whether they're right or wrong, but based on whether they feel good or not. And that's a problem when it comes to moral arguments, because we don't deal with traditions, we don't deal with other philosophical schools, but rather we make these decisions and fit the type of moral philosophy that we want to our decisions, whether or not it's right or wrong. So anyway, in summary, MacIntyre sees that our culture lacks an understanding of the good. All moral judgments in the absence of a discernible objectivity become objects of preference, and there's no substance in our moral arguments. It's just kind of pick and choose. So your question for today, which was Wednesday, is what is emotivism? Why is it problematic? We'll get to the question of what it means to solve the problem. Where we go from here? How do we get outside of this thought process of emotivism and how things are emotionally charged in our moral discourses on Friday. But today, I want you to answer that question. What is emotivism? And make sure that you're entering into conversation with your peers about it too, because this is a big problem for moral discourse. And I want you to note as you go through the class, whenever you make a moral position or you claim some type of perspective on moral knowledge, are you doing it because it feels right, or are you doing it because it is a part of this tradition that names something as true? So this is the task for today. Your directions are in Moodle, and I hope that you enjoy MacIntyre. He has a lot to offer. All right, thanks, guys.